Imagine you are standing at the edge of a river, crossing somewhere in what had once been the Roman province of Gallia in the year 742. The wooden dock beneath your feet is gray and splintered, nothing like the stone quays that once served Roman cargo vessels. A shallow drafted boat, barely large enough for a dozen barrels, is being dragged against the current by men leaning hard into leather harnesses. The cargo is modest by any standard. A few bolts of rough linen, with some dried fish packed in salt, a small chest of iron ingots wrapped in oiled cloth. This is what trade looks like in the 8th century. Not the gleaming merchant fleets of Ostia, not the wagon convoys thundering along Roman roads with military escorts. This is survival commerce. Cautious, slow, precious, and fragile, in a way that the ancient world would not have recognized. And yet, something remarkable is happening on this riverbank. Something that the old story of the Dark Ages rarely tells. The people around you are not simply scavenging in the ruins of a lost civilization. They are building something new. The ingots in that chest were smelted from ore dug out of hillside mines in what is now Belgium. The linen came from a monastery that also operates a mill, a brewery, and a scriptorium. The men hauling the boat wear iron buckles on their belts, carry iron-tipped tools in their packs. Masaka know exactly where in the next town they can find a smith capable of reforging a broken plowshare or a cracked sword pommel. In 742, the knowledge of metals, the movement of goods, and the practical technologies of daily survival are not extinct. They are simply scaled down, localized, and woven into a social fabric that looks nothing like Rome and everything like the world that would eventually become medieval Europe. To understand why 742 matters for trade and technology, Amars, you need to understand what had happened in the 2 centuries before it. The Western Roman Empire's administrative collapse in 476 had not been a single catastrophic event, but a long, uneven contraction. The great road network, perhaps 400,000 kilometers at its peak, did not vanish overnight. But without legions to maintain the surfaces, without imperial tax revenue to fund repairs, without the commercial volume that had once justified the infrastructure, stretches of road became impassable within a generation. By the 7th century, many major Roman roads were seasonal tracks, where they had not been absorbed into local field systems or simply buried under encroaching vegetation. The bridges were often the first things to go. Wooden bridges rotted without maintenance. Stone bridges survived better, but required communities large enough and organized enough to clear debris, manage floods, and make repairs. And those communities were far less common than they had been. The effect on trade was severe, but not total. What happened was a dramatic rescaling and rerouting. Long-distance commerce did not disappear in the post-Roman West. It shrank, became riskier, concentrated on a handful of navigable rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse, the Seine, the Rhone, and shifted away from overland convoys toward water transport wherever possible. Rivers, which had always been important arteries of Roman commerce, that became even more central. A loaded cart traveling a rutted track between 2 former Roman towns might take days and break an axle. The same goods floated downstream on a flat-bottomed river barge could cover the same distance in hours. This is why, by the early 8th century, many of the most commercially active places in Carolingian Europe were not the old Roman administrative centers inland, but rather river ports, coastal emporia, and estuary settlements. Among the most significant of these trading nodes were the emporia known from archaeological evidence and from contemporary Carolingian sources. Places like Quentovic at the mouth of the Cancha River in northern France, and Dorestad at the confluence of the Rhine and the Lech in what is now the Netherlands. were functioning as genuine commercial hubs by the early 8th century. Excavations at Dorestad, in particular, have revealed a remarkable picture of early medieval trade in action. Though the site covers several hundred hectares and shows evidence of specialized craft production, warehousing, a substantial waterfront with multiple docking facilities extending far into the river, and a diverse material culture that includes pottery, glass, millstones, and coins drawn from across northern Europe and beyond. Dorestad in 742 was not a Roman city. It had no forum, no baths, no colonnaded streets. But it was a living, working commercial center processing thousands of tons of goods per year. And its existence tells us that the idea of the Dark Ages as a period of economic extinction is too simple by far. What were people actually trading in this world? The commodity that sits at the heart of early medieval exchange, the one that appears again and again in both archaeological assemblages and written sources, is iron. Not in the refined, abundant quantities the Roman world had produced, but iron nonetheless, in moving steadily along rivers and tracks, from the places where ore could be smelted to the settlements that needed it. The Carolingian world of 742 was deeply iron-dependent in ways that are easy to underestimate. Iron tipped the plowshares that opened the heavy clay soils of northern Europe. Iron formed the axes that felled the timber for hull construction and fuel. Iron shod horses, pinned boat planks, edged swords and scramus axes, clasped belt buckles, and reinforced wagon wheels. Without a steady supply of iron, early medieval agriculture, construction, and defense would have collapsed. The production of iron in this period was a labor-intensive, fuel-hungry process carried out in bloomery furnaces. Simple shaft furnaces built from clay, charged with layers of charcoal and iron ore, and driven by bellows worked by hand or foot. A successful smelt produced a bloom of consolidated iron mixed with slag that then had to be hammered extensively to drive out impurities and produce workable metal. The process was inefficient by later standards. A bloomery might produce only a few kilograms of usable iron per smelt after hours of work and considerable fuel consumption. But archaeologists have found bloomery sites across early medieval Europe in numbers that suggest the technology was widespread and regularly practiced at the village and estate level, not just in specialist centers. Sites in the Weald of southeast England, in the Ardennes region of modern Belgium and Luxembourg, and across the Rhineland show evidence of continuous iron production through the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. The knowledge did not die with Rome. It retreated from industrial scale to local practice and stayed there, sustaining communities through centuries of instability. Smithing in 742 occupied a social position difficult to overstate. The smith who could work iron was not merely a craftsman in the modern economic sense. He was a figure of practical magic in a world where metal seemed to transform from ore to tool through processes that ordinary people did not fully understand. The smith's forge was hot, loud, and dangerous. It produced objects that could mean the difference between a successful harvest and starvation, between a warrior surviving a battle and dying in it. It is not coincidental that smith figures appear in the mythological traditions of nearly every early medieval culture. In Norse tradition, the figure of Volundr, the master smith of the gods, appears in the poetry preserved in the Codex Regius as an archetype of otherworldly craft skill. In Anglo-Saxon tradition, the name Wayland the Smith carries similar resonances of power and mystery. Even in early Christian contexts, the imagery of the divine craftsman who shapes creation was potent. The man who stood at the forge was, in the imagination of his community, touching something that went beyond ordinary labor. Beyond iron, early medieval trade moved a handful of other key commodities with particular regularity. Salt was essential for food preservation in a world without refrigeration. Wood in its production and transport generated significant commercial activity. Salt-making sites along the Atlantic coast, in the estuary regions of the Rhine and the Meuse, and in inland brine springs in areas like Cheshire in England or Halle in the Rhineland, were among the most economically significant industrial sites of the period. A Carolingian estate document from roughly this era, the Capitulare de Villis, issued slightly later under Charlemagne, but reflecting practices already established by the 740s, mentions salt among the essential supplies that royal estates must secure. The movement of salt from production site to inland settlement was one of the few genuinely long-distance trades that survived the Roman collapse, with its commercial character more or less intact. Millstones form another fascinating window into early medieval technology and trade. The best millstones for grinding grain came from specific geological formations, particularly the volcanic basalt lava deposits around the Eifel region of the Rhineland, near modern Mayen in Germany. These stones, identifiable by their distinctive reddish-gray volcanic texture, have been found by archaeologists at sites across England, France, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia in large numbers. Their presence at early medieval settlements, far from their geological source, is direct physical evidence of functioning long-distance trade networks in the 8th century. Someone had to organize the quarrying of the stone, its transport down the Rhine by boat, its transfer to coastal vessels, and its eventual distribution to buyers who specifically sought out this material because they knew it ground grain more efficiently and cleanly than local stone alternatives. This is not subsistence. This is specialized commercial logistics operating across hundreds of kilometers, sustained by knowledge, trust, and economic demand, even in the so-called Dark Ages. Pottery and glass round out the material picture. Roman mass-produced fine wares had disappeared from Western European archaeological assemblages by the late 6th or early 7th century. In their place, local production traditions of varying quality supplied most settlements with the coarse cooking vessels, storage containers, and drinking cups they needed. But not all ceramic production was crudely local. The Bodorf-type wares produced in the Rhineland by the early 8th century, and the Tating ware decorated with tin foil that appears at high-status sites across Carolingian Europe, show that specialist pottery production and its associated trade networks were functioning by the time of our story. Glass, which required skilled artisans and specific raw materials, had contracted dramatically from Roman production levels, but had not vanished. Window glass appears at elite monastic sites in early 8th century England and Francia. And drinking vessels of glass, some imported, some locally produced, still appear in the grave assemblages and settlement debris of the Carolingian aristocracy and wealthy monasteries. These objects were expensive and rare in ways they had not been under Rome, which itself tells a story about what had been lost and how slowly it was being rebuilt. The year 742 sits at a particular historical inflection point for this story of recovery. In that year, a church council held at Lestin, in what is now Belgium, one of several reform councils organized under the authority of Carloman, the Carolingian mayor of the palace, addressed among other things the organization of church resources, the obligations of monasteries to support military campaigns, and the proper conduct of clergy. These councils are often read through a purely religious or political lens, but they also reflect something important about the administrative capacity of the Carolingian world in 742. The ability to hold coordinated church councils across multiple regions, to send messengers and collect responses, to issue written decisions that would be implemented at the local level, depended on networks of communication and transport that were functional enough to make coordination possible. A world of pure fragmentation and isolation cannot hold councils. The Carolingian reform program of the 740s, including the famous missions of Boniface of Mainz, who was reorganizing the Frankish Church with papal authority in precisely these years, presupposed a world with enough infrastructure, enough literacy concentrated in monastic and episcopal centers, and enough commercial activity to sustain the movement of ideas, people, and documents. That infrastructure was rough, slow, and limited compared to what came before or after. But walking beside the river in 742, watching that boat with its iron ingots pulled upstream, you can see something that took historians a long time to fully appreciate. This world was not simply waiting for a better era to begin. It was already building one. The monks at the scriptorium copying manuscripts were also managing fish ponds and grain mills. The smith heating his bloomery forge was also the person the local lord consulted about sword repair, and the local farmer consulted about plowshare maintenance. The merchant risking his goods on a river journey was also carrying news, connecting communities, and making possible the slow accumulation of surplus and specialization that leads eventually to towns, to markets, to something recognizable as an economy again. The wheeled iron sites in England are still visible in the landscape today as subtle earthworks and ponds created by ancient smelting operations. The basalt millstones quarried near Mayen sit in museum collections across northern Europe. The bed of the old Rhine Channel near Dorestad can be walked in part today, a landscape that remembers the boats and the salt and the iron ingots of the 8th century, even if the wharves are long gone. And what these people figured out, in conditions of severe constraint and persistent danger, was not how to rebuild Rome. It was how to survive without it, and in doing so, how to build something new. The technologies were smaller in scale, the trade networks shorter in reach, the political structures more fragile and local. But the knowledge moved, the iron moved, the millstones moved. And across those movements, across those rivers and forest tracks and monastic guest houses, on the early medieval world slowly assembled the material and institutional foundations on which everything that came after would eventually stand. The weight of what had been lost was real and enormous. But so, it turns out, was the persistence of the people who worked with what remained.